It's so cool that we have a season 5, and we are super grateful to the Frank C. Chen Foundation for their continued support of this program. I never expected back in the end of 2021 that we would be doing season 5 of this show. And thank you all for listening. We appreciate all the letters and emails and follows on Facebook, social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have promised that we will deliver big tales in this coming season, big names, et cetera, and we will. But today we're going to talk about a big subject, and we're going to kick off with a topic suggestion that actually comes from a listener, a guy called Richard, who suggested that we cover Taiwan's population problems, which is a really big deal. So this year, 2025, Taiwan will become a super-aged society. And a super-aged society is one with 20% or more of the population that is 65 years or older. And, as you might expect, things are going to only get grayer. The government estimates that by 2039, those 65 or older will account for 30% of Taiwan's total population. So, of course, John, it's good people are living longer. Life expectancy is 81 years old currently. But this, matched with very low fertility rates, means Taiwan is facing a demographic crisis.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation.
Formosa Files.
A train going off a cliff.
Yeah. Today, the population of Taiwan is 23.4 million. By 2070, it's predicted to have dropped to 15 million.
15 million wouldn't be a bad thing in some ways. Less crowded island would be nice.
Yeah, it would be nice to have less people on the beach and all of that, but big problems. The median age in 2070, and this is when my kids are going to be, needing support and all that, is going to be 62.4. So the number of working age individuals supporting each elderly person, which is now 3.6 workers for one, will be 1 for 1 in 2070.
And to think it wasn't that long ago that Taiwan had too many children.
One of the lowest birth rates in the world. The fertility rate needed to maintain a population is 2.1 kids per woman. And obviously you can't have a 0.1 of a child, but you get the point. Taiwan's rate is roughly half that, about 1 child per woman. We are the second lowest in Asia. Number 1 is South Korea, but we're right behind. Here's an interesting fact. Last year was the year of the dragon, which is a lucky year. Normally, we would expect a little baby bump in a dragon year, but no. It registered 134,856 births, a record low number for the ROC.
Yeah, shocking. And, the dragon year, it didn't work. Likewise, the cultural bedrock of Chinese folk religion, culture of life, ancestor worship, having a male heir to carry on a family line and to worship the ancestors, no longer a driving force strong enough to keep people having babies.
And also, last year was the 9th consecutive year of falling births. So a trend that is definitely, as you said, a train going in the wrong direction with a cliff in front of it. Okay, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's travel back in time to when there were first some good population numbers, and that would be the Japanese colonial era.
Yes, starting in 1905, the Japanese colonial government performed detailed population censuses every 5 years. So in 1905, the population of Taiwan was roughly 3 million. At the end of that period, 1945, it was double, about 6 million people.
Okay, doubled over a span of 40 years. How does that work out as like a yearly percentage? My math is terrible.
Well, yeah, I calculated it. A little under 2%, which makes sense with Japan's medical advances here, hygiene, agricultural development, irrigation, and so on.
2%, okay. And after World War II, the population increased at an even greater rate, of course. There was the influx from China, roughly 1.2 soldiers and civilians. So the number is disputed by some. And high birth rates. Taiwan averaged about 6.3 births deaths per woman in the 1950s.
So the nationalists moved their government here, 1949, lots of refugees, and there's a population boom in Taiwan, which at the time is an agricultural society. Most people live in the countryside. Children can help on the farms, so they're not such a burden, and the government wants more children to support the war effort against the commies.
Okay. So our population story really requires us to take a look at a very remarkable organization, the Sino-U.S. Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction. So this U.S.-funded organization was behind the hugely successful land reform program, improving agriculture by crop and livestock improvements. And so, what was it, John, from 51 to 65?
From 1951 to 1965, around one-third of U.S. government aid to Taiwan was directed by the GCRR, this Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction. And Taiwan had an agricultural revolution before its manufacturing took off. That's often forgotten.
This agricultural organization also has a connection to population policy.
Yeah, the chairman of the JCRR, Jiang Menglin, was the first official to openly support birth control, although that wasn't his initial position. Originally, he thought increased agricultural production through modernization would deal with the increased mouths that needed feeding.
But as Jiang, and it's the same Jiang as Chiang Kai-shek, but they're not related, as he became familiar with farm areas and starts doing more research, he changes his mind.
Yeah, he saw large families living in terrible conditions, high infant mortality, and he started warning about overpopulation.
He did indeed. He said, Dr. Jiang said, the population increase at the time was the equivalent of adding the population of Kaohsiung City every year to Taiwan. So Kaohsiung at that time was Taiwan's second largest city. So adding the population of Kaohsiung every year.
Oh, nice little insertion of Kaohsiung.
Thank you.
Anyway, U.S. representatives from the commission also noted that Taiwan couldn't sustain its population growth rate. But most Taiwanese officials, the government, remained unconvinced.
Right. This is before democracy. It's young men needed for retaking the mainland. Taiwan wasn't ready yet, but an army had to be built up for recovering China. And I remember some KMT officials quoting Dr. Sun Yat-sen on population, basically positive views on how a large population could provide military and economic strength. And then, as you noted earlier, the whole Chinese culture thing about it being a virtue to have many descendants, especially preferably male. Mm-hmm.
But Dr. Jiang and the JCRR didn't give up. They continued to warn about overpopulation. They produced a family planning booklet called Happy Family, and they carried out a survey in rural areas.
The research they carried out confirmed what many people had seen with their own eyes, and that is that large families were not necessarily happy families. There was high maternal and child mortality.
High maternal and child mortality. So mothers dying in childbirth and a lot of babies and children dying too.
And another negative part of high fertility was the high level of adoption, kids being given away, abandoned, even sold.
Yeah, you had a very good interview episode with Nancy Baldwin. She was one of these young kids sold.
If you've been in Taiwan long enough, you know somebody's grandfather or somebody who's like, no, they were not originally, they can't. It was pretty common.
Yes, surprisingly so. An NGO funded by the JCRR was set up in 1954 called the China Family Planning Association, and they worked in military dependence villages.
Okay, so in Chinese, it'll be Junchun, military-dependent villages. There's not many of them, if any, left these days, but there used to be lots of these little hamlets, enclaves, filled with people from China, and they were called military dependence villages. But, this whole family planning association thing was actually against the political wishes of some KMT leaders, yeah?
Yeah, but it could be sold as just providing medical help. And also, they pushed an argument, which made sense increasingly as we get into the 50s, The soldiers for retaking the mainland had already been born in the early 1950s. The ones born from now on would not be needed. So, they wouldn't be ready in time for retaking the mainland.
Yeah, okay. So in 1959, Jiang held a press conference to present a paper he'd written titled, "Let Us Face the Increasingly Urgent Population Problem of Taiwan." And this paper urged the government to focus on the quality instead of the quantity of the population. And I have to say, hearing those words, speaking them out loud, make me a little uncomfortable. It sounds a little Nazi, quality over quantity, but I guess I understand what he's saying. In general, he's just saying overpopulation is a bad idea.
Yes. I'd like to add a word about this Jiang Menglin fellow. It's popular nowadays to dismiss a lot of the KMT leaders as incompetent, corrupt, authoritarian, but we need some nuance. There were a lot of highly capable KMT people helping to build the foundations of a thriving Taiwan. Amazing talent. Take Jiang, for example, born in China, 1886.
1886, so that makes him 1 year older than CKS.
Yeah, he did advanced studies in the United States, agriculture at Berkeley University, California, then did a PhD in education at Columbia University, New York. Back in China, he served as president of a highly prestigious Peking University, and he served in several high offices, such as Minister of Education, before he became the chairman of this rural reconstruction organization.
That is quite a resume. And with his efforts, the first government-sponsored family planning initiative was finally launched, and this was in 1961 in Nantou County. Seems a little funny today when you think about it, with Nantou being so sparsely populated, yeah. But back then, it was a different story, and the focus in 1961 was on women who had 4 or more children, and they were encouraged to use contraception.
There was a big study and trial project in Taichung in the early 1960s, and this was a success. And in 1964, the government announced its support for birth control. The first nationwide family planning program was launched, and the main form of contraception was the IUD. I think sometimes, was it called the loop? Something inserted into a woman, but I'm unfamiliar.
Yes, it's always been, unfortunately, women's responsibility when really, if the scientists were honest, they should be focusing on men.
Hey, wait. Other forms of contraception were added. The pill, I think that came in 67, condoms, 1970, and sterilization. They started doing that in 73, I think.
But, of course, these things were new, and new things require persuasion and education. This would come in various forms, so female health workers would visit couples at home. Sometimes they'd give the couples vouchers they could take to clinics or pharmacies.
Right, so you have these field workers going out, handing out vouchers. And when parents registered the births of kids at household registration offices, there would be a family planning counter in the office. Couples would get a booklet, they'd get advice. There was also group education in places like factories.
In 1967, the government introduced its 3-3-3-3-3. Yeah, so 5 threes campaign. Wonderfully Chinese numbers.
Yeah.
It was a public service promotion that couples wait 3 years after marriage before having a kid.
3 years after marriage. Not a bad idea, but easier said than done.
The next 3, allowing 3 years between each pregnancy.
I'd prefer 2 years, less of an age difference between kids. I think it's better.
Yeah. I have a 3-year age gap between my 2 kids, and the next guideline was no more than 3 children.
And the last 2 threes, I think this is cheating. Women should stop giving birth after the age of 33.
So the 2 threes. Okay. 33. Funny when you think about the stories that were told about the indigenous people who wouldn't even have started until then.
That's right. The Siraya people in modern-day Tainan, they had this very strange prohibition against having children before women were into their mid-30s.
So in 1971, the guidelines were changed to promote having no more than 2 children. So the 33333 was replaced by 3321. Wait 3 years before having your first, wait another 3, and then stop at 2.
3321. And the 1?
Well, the 1 was that boys and girls are the same. They're equal, so don't worry about that. 1.
That doesn't really make sense or work.
Yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you needed the numbers. It was important. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't work. And a new slogan caught on. In English, it would have been, one child is never too little, or few, I guess. 2 children is just enough.
And when we say these were guidelines, that's what these were. They were not edicts. There were no punishments.
Yeah, this is not China.
Although actually, China's one-child policy was actually started later than most people think. It was a couple of years after Mao Zedong's death. It started around about 1978, and it lasted until 2015. They changed it to a 2-child limit, and nowadays it's 3.
Yeah, Mao Zedong was quite the opposite. He was the more the merrier. He had no problem with starvation and other issues involved with overpopulation. Moving away from that person, in Taiwan, the family planning guidelines worked, or at least they didn't get a lot of resistance because couples started wanting smaller families. So this is a time of huge urbanization, people moving out of the country into the cities. And as anybody who lives in a city knows, raising a kid in the city is expensive. And kids aren't, huge financial contributors to families for the most part.
Indeed. Between 1961 and 1981, 20 years, Taiwan's fertility rate fell from 5.59 births per woman to 2.46.
Okay, 2.46. And just a quick reminder, 2.1 is considered the replacement rate required to maintain a population. So 2.46 is getting close.
But just 5 years later, 1986, Taiwan's fertility rate had dropped to 1.68 births per woman, below replacement.
So the Department of Health in 1996 put out a new slogan, which said, 2 children are just enough, but 3 children are not too many, to paraphrase. I'll put the actual Chinese on the website of what the slogan was. But yeah, you could have 2, but 3 would be nice too.
Yeah. With the sharp decrease in the birth rate from the 1950s to the end of the century, there was a big change in population demographics, that is, the population structure. Lots of trends have combined to create the current situation of an average of 1 child per woman. One of these trends is later marriage. The average age of first marriages in Taiwan is currently 32.3 for men and 30.4 for women.
I think I got married when I was in my late 20s.
I held off longer than you.
Good for you. All right. Well, not only has marriage been put off, but, many women are just choosing not to marry at all. We could give numbers, but don't want to drown you with the numbers for every topic. It's probably better we find a human story, an interesting individual case. And John, you have one.
We've got a very special person, former President Tsai Ing-wen, 2-term president 2016 to 2024.
Yeah, Tsai Ing-wen. We came across some very interesting information that it doesn't seem to be very well known about her in Nikki Alsford's book, Taiwan Lives, A Social and Political History.
Yes, so our former president, she was born on August 31st, 1956 at the George Mackay Hospital in Taipei. She was her mother's 4th and final child and her father's 11th child. Yes, confusing. We'll clear that up later.
Yeah, 11. Okay. Let's go back to Tsai's father because his life kind of encapsulates the changes Taiwan went through. This man was from Fangxiang in Pingdong County, Taiwan's southernmost county. So Hakka on his father's side and Paiwan on his mother's. So Paiwan, one of Taiwan's indigenous groups.
Her father was a teenager during the Pacific War, And when he was 18, he went to northeast China. Well, technically, it was the Japanese state of Manchukuo, a puppet state. He trained as a mechanic and repaired aircraft. A smart move, volunteering and learning a skill. Better than being sent on a death sentence, to the jungles of Southeast Asia.
Definitely. And then after the war, Tsai's father establishes a delivery company and an auto repair shop. Then in 1968, moves to Taipei and begins trading in secondhand automobiles. And, I wish I could go back in time and do this, he invested in real estate. So the book says, quote, Tsai purchased land in the Zhongshan district of Taipei City, which proved to be very profitable, end quote.
Daddy Tsai had four wives and 11 children. Tsai Ing-wen's mother was his fourth wife, with whom he had 4 children. Now, wives, technically illegal, but yeah, this is not like divorce one and then get another one. This is what it was, and not uncommon.
No, not uncommon at all. So, as the youngest of 11 siblings, you might assume, or one might assume, that Tsai Ing-wen, as the youngest, would have been spoiled or, not had much pressure. But evidently, it wasn't the case, or she has some very strong ambition and is self-motivated, or, I don't know. But she studied law at National Taiwan University. Then she gets a master's degree from Cornell, and then more education. And I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but more education for women in the world we live in, especially at that time, actually does equal lowering of your marriage prospects. Is that fair to say, John?
Yeah, that's the reality. Don't be afraid to describe reality.
So she earns a PhD in law at the London School of Economics, the LSE. That's back in 1984. So very highly educated person.
Incredible. A lot of education, especially for a woman at that time. But it's a trend and one that would become increasingly common. So in the 1980s, the 1990s, we see a steady increase of the number of women going to university. Actually, just after the turn of the millennium, first years of the 2000s, women start outnumbering men at university.
Going to Tsai Ing-wen and her marital status. Okay, so reading from Nikki Olsford's book, quote, during her university years, Tsai had a number of suitors, but she chose to focus on her studies. During her Cornell years, Tsai had a boyfriend whom she planned to marry. Sadly, he died in a mountain climbing accident. Her long-term single status led to unfortunate questions concerning her sexuality during her presidential election bid in 2012, which Tsai, and in my opinion quite smartly, refused to comment on. And by 2016, he writes, the topic no longer came up publicly. That's fascinating. She's never talked about that publicly at all.
Yeah. That the topic no longer came up publicly. I'm not sure about that. I have recollections of some opposition politicians trying to make an issue of her being unmarried, that she didn't understand the struggles and concerns of families.
Not just opposition, her own party. There were plenty of very old-fashioned people. I remember a quote from one of them that said, people who wear skirts shouldn't be running countries. Yeah, it was like, whoa, old school sexism, And yes, they were commenting on, how can you
Yeah. There was some speculation. Was she gay, lesbian, but it didn't carry much weight, did it?
No. To the credit of Taiwanese people, especially younger people. Yeah. I guess one of the reasons people were speculating was because she did come out in favor of LGBTQ issues, and it was May of 2019 that it was finally legalized, but it was 2 years before that the Supreme Court gave them a deadline to legalize it. There are some people who would like to give credit all to the Tsai government, but the reality of the situation is the Supreme Court, a case went before it. They ordered the government to figure it out. There was much wrangling, and for a little while there, they were coming up with like a separate but equal idea. And eventually they did the right thing. But yeah, it was under her leadership, technically, same-sex marriage was the first country in Asia to do so.
I wonder if Tsai Ing-wen was just too busy for marriage, or had a bad impression of marriage from her messy family background. Anyway, we go from a dad with multiple wives, a family of 11. We go from that to an unmarried, childless woman with cats, because she kept cats. She keeps cats. It's certainly a huge change.
She has dogs too. Are you calling our former president, our very respected former president, a cat lady?
No, I was quite clever. I said an unmarried, childless woman with cats.
Oh, and that's different.
Yeah, the term cat lady can have some negative associations, sort of like a middle-aged, older woman, eccentric.
Eccentric, or a polite way of saying crazy.
Yes, interesting. But yeah, we're discussing fertility. I think it's relevant. Here I'm thinking about younger women, not cat women, aged women. I'm thinking young women, young Taiwanese couples, singles, especially in the big cities. They're choosing to raise pets instead of having children.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, you can see dogs and prams, baby strollers. They're wearing clothes. Very much they look like children's substitutes.
Yeah, okay, I see what you did. Fair enough. You dug yourself out of that hole of cat lady thing. It's true. It's true. We are seeing people substitute animals. Okay, let's turn to some possible solutions for the declining number of babies, young people. What are the main possibilities? Robots, immigration, encouraging higher birth rates.
Well, I don't think robot girlfriends will help.
No.
Oh, you mean robot
Yes,
workers. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Well, Taiwan has been using migrant labor, bringing in foreign workers, especially workers for low-end jobs, factories, construction, caregivers, since the late 1980s, early 90s.
It may be that early, but it really got going roughly during the Chen Shui-bian administration when they had these massive MRT projects. But these migrants go home after a 3-year contract. So they're not immigrants. They sometimes stay for 2 contracts.
Right. So, they're not really immigrants. Okay, but we have had foreign brides immigrating here for 3 decades now. Our birth rate, as low as it is, would be much lower without their reproductive help.
It's true. Foreign brides, Chinese women and Southeast Asian women.
Yeah, the biggest source of wives is China. Marriage with Chinese was legalized in 1992. Here are some numbers from 2010. The country supplying the most foreign brides was China with 64%, surprisingly high. Vietnam, second with 20%. Indonesia, third with 7%.
And the total number of foreign brides was high.
Yeah, it hit a peak in 2003. 31.9% of all registered marriages.
Almost a third of all marriages were to foreign women. That's pretty amazing.
That figure for the percentage of marriages to foreign brides has come down, but it's still pretty high. Maybe like 20%, higher than in Japan and South Korea.
It's incredible when you think about it, how popular foreign brides became in such a short time.
Right. Started in the early 90s. Quite a few Taiwanese men, especially from rural areas, like where I live, they began to go to Southeast Asia on these trips looking for a bride.
So, I don't want to be cruel, but it boils down to what? Them not being good catches here and they just couldn't find a local woman?
In part. Taiwanese women becoming too educated and, rural incomes are low. Farming work is really hard and doesn't pay well.
And there's a slight male-female imbalance, slightly more males. Back to possible solutions. I've given you robots, which are not viable for fertility. What was that? Foreign brides possible, and what else?
Well, there aren't any solutions, really. Even if you doubled fertility, the number of young women of a childbearing age, not enough of them. They would need to be having 4 kids each.
Whoa.
You need some really pretty radical pro-natal policies for any movement on fertility.
Tough. All these governments of counties, they've tried little payments like move to Pingdong in this place and you get 10,000 and free diapers or whatever, or subsidized housing. but it's not working. It's just not working.
Pretty bleak, but we always like to end on a happy note, don't we?
So that leaves robots and immigration. I am so pro-immigration. If you've been here for 5 years or so as an Indonesian or a Filipino, you should have the right to be able to start making
give them a pathway to citizenship. They've been here, they know the country.
Start with, the same thing that you and I have, permanent residency, and then move forward. There's 800,000, at least, migrant workers in Taiwan. You can't tell me that a third of those people wouldn't want to become Taiwanese citizens or more. There's also been talk recently of introducing migrant workers, as they're called, into the military, into the armed forces, because we're at 80% strength right now, which actually means less because you need redundancy, right, for sick people or whatever. So we can't find people willing to do that. And so what if you were allowed to come in, serve 4 years as even a cook or a construction or engineer or a mechanic or something like this? And then you had a pathway to citizenship. These are all great ideas. I'm going to keep going on my sermon here, John. The only reason America is because of immigration. Australia, even Western Europe, Germany, Sweden, they're facing the same issues, but they let people in. And sure, there are issues that have to be dealt with, but Taiwan needs to pull themselves out of this ostrich hole and realize that immigration really is the solution.
It's a better solution than coming under communist slavery.
Yes. Or having 15 million people in 2070 and pushing each other's wheelchairs. Like, it just doesn't work. Interesting to see how things change, because when you and I were younger, the whole world was worried about exploding populations and how are we going to feed the people of the future? And now we're like, what people of the future? What's that Chinese idiom? People mountain, people sea? Not so much anymore. And if you're a young person and you just got married, a couple, and you're thinking of having children, go ahead and do it, even if it's one. It's an interesting experience. And there's nothing wrong if you decide not to and would rather be, as John put it, a cat woman.
Get rid of the cats.
I actually have. I've always had cats.
Start breeding.
I have a cat, as well as children. So I'm a cat man.
You've been listening to Formosa Files. I am John Ross.
Meow. I'm Eryk Michael Smith. Bye.